and what does it mean to you to be a part of this celebration?
I think just from the musician point of view, anytime that you're able to attract people to hear a wide range of jazz music as is being presented by this festival, it's quite a broad spectrum of jazz artists. Anytime that you're able to draw new people to the art form, I think that's a fantastic thing, because I love to play, but it's really nice when there are people out there listening. We need the audience for all the reasons that you can imagine. It's my hope that some people may come to this festival to hear me or some of the other acts, not knowing that much about this music, and might leave like saying, wow, I kind of dig this, or I'm going to check out a CD, or maybe I'll tune into jazz radio a little more often. So that's just on the pure musical level. That's very important to me. As somebody who has been openly gay in the jazz world, maybe one of the first to come out in a very, very visible way about more than 20 years ago, I think it's great to assemble such a wonderful cast of diverse musicians from the LGBT community that make this kind of music. I'm very happy to be part of it. I will admit the subtitle, America's First Queer Jazz Festival, I had some issue with that.
So I don't even need to ask that question, but no. I did want to address it. What about the term? What about the phrase itself? Give me a pause.
Well, I mean, I understand in theory the idea of taking something that's, most of us would consider a pejorative term or has been used historically in a negative context, and turning it into something positive and kind of in your face in a way. I understand that. It may be a generational thing. I'm going to be 60 next year, so of course I'm very comfortable with the idea of gay or being part of the LGBT community, which I think is pretty comprehensive. Or more, I think is pretty comprehensive. It's hard to say why I had such a strong reaction. I think part of it was that I wasn't aware that that was going to be the subtitle or the explanatory under the festival title.
Right.
And I may have read it in Jazz Times or the New York Times.
It does raise the interesting question of generation, because I think it's significant to consider the time in which you sort of processed the jazz life as a separate part of your life than your identification as a gay man, and some of the tensions that you felt at that time, and the reconciling them was a process and sort of a journey for you. And I would imagine that for a jazz musician who is now, say, 22, just coming out of a music school, who is gay and a jazz musician, that the sort of disjunction there is probably an entirely different situation.
I agree. I mean, when I grew up in the Midwest in Cincinnati, Ohio. The only thing that I ever knew in high school about gayness, I mean, other than the fact that I was attracted to men, was I had a 7th grade Latin teacher, and one day he was no longer teaching. I kind of asked around, and my mother, in suitably vague but not so hard to detect language, he said that he was doing something inappropriate down at the bus station. And so that was really the only time until I was 18 years old that I was aware of a gay person. You know, now high schools have, you know, gay-straight alliances. You see tons of positive role models in the gay community, in the media, on television, in movies, in politics. You know, people are getting married. It's a very different world. What attracted me to the jazz world in Cincinnati in the early days was just the kind of wonderful, colorful assortment of people who were playing this music, which was really on the fringe. There was no jazz education that I was aware of. I didn't know what a downbeat magazine was. People had nicknames like the Dancing Bear, you know, just all these kind of kooky people that hung out around this music. And I felt like, well, it didn't matter whether I was young, old, white, black. I could belong to this club of musicians if I felt that if they felt I could play.
Right. That's always the sort of injunction, right? Can you play?
Right.
You know, if you can play, you can hang.
Right.
Can we step back just a little,
Sure.
though? Because one thing about your career, there's a real interaction with classical music as well. And your upbringing as a musician, as a pianist, there was a classical element early on, and you essentially made a kind of choice. You know, you sort of felt jazz is really the way that I want to go.
Well, improvising was more fun than practicing Chopin etudes. And hanging out in clubs with people that my parents would prefer I not associate with was also much more fun. It was a kind of no-brainer. I always liked to improvise, and then I found jazz, and I said, wow, this is this language that we can use to improvise together without any rehearsal, without any music on the music stand. I mean, nobody had any sheet music, you know. It was just, you had to know the tunes, and you had to be able to swing and hang out and, you know, be a decent human being. And you know, then, you know, as I got into my early 20s, and certainly in New York, I began to realize, well, maybe my gayness, you know, does set me apart a little bit. Of course, you know, classical music's had a huge influence on my music making and the way that I approach the instrument and the way that I teach. You know, jazz, you know, real jazz is at the heart of everything that I do. I mean, that's my home base, artistically.
Well, since you just mentioned you know, coming to New York and feeling like, you know, I'm not sure what wording you used exactly, but this idea that being gay was, you know, something separate, or something that you had to kind of keep under wraps in a way. Could you describe what sort of measures you felt you needed to take? Were you sort of, you know, did friends know, but you just kind of kept it off the bandstand? What was the nature of that negotiation? Yeah,
that was sort of close. Anybody who knew me, you know, knew that I was. But band leaders that I played with at that time, Art Farmer, Joe Henderson, Stan Getz, I never, you know, discussed it. There was really no way of discussing it. I'm sure, I mean, after playing with Art for 4 or 5 years, I mean, I'm sure he knew, but we just never said it. And when Sam Jones, who's a great, great bass player, one of the all-time great bass players, and a real mentor to me, and the fact that I was playing with him meant I had serious cred. You know, if I was approved by him, that unlocked a lot of doors to me. He died in '81 or '82, and I never really talked to him about this. I felt like, wow, there's something sad about that, you know. I felt the same way when the great saloon owner Bradley Cunningham, who had the famous club Bradley's in New York, where I got my start, really. You know, when he passed away, I never really told him. And meanwhile, I had told my grandmothers, you know, because I didn't want them to pass away not knowing who I was. And just a side note, I think it's really sweet. My father's mother, who was a pianist, I told her when I was 19, and she lived to be 97, and even at the end, she would, when we would talk, she would always say, "Do you have a special friend these days?" Which I thought was really sweet, you know. It was just her way of,
Yeah.
But at least she was interested, you know. She wanted to know if I had love in my life, you know. I think that was really cool.
There's a story that you told me the first time we had a conversation, and I think it's subsequently been published. I think David Haydu printed it in a profile of you in the Times Magazine. But I wonder if you could tell this audience, I believe it involves Stan Getz and a toothbrush.
Yeah, the toothbrush. I've lived in the same loft in Soho on Broadway between Prince and Spring for 35 years now, rent stabilized. And back then Soho was not what it is now. It's a major shopping mall. Back then it was definitely funkier, art galleries, so on and so forth. Anyway, I was rehearsing with Stan Getz for the first time around 82, I think, because I was living at that time with my first lover, Eric. And I'm in the back of the building, and you have to walk down this really long hallway. The building is a whole block long. So Stan rings the bell, I buzz him in, you know, I think, oh, he's coming down the hall, and I had this freak out moment that, oh my God, there are 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom. And what's he gonna think when he sees that there are 2 toothbrushes there? He's gonna say, oh, there must be somebody living here. You know, and I don't have a girlfriend, and I'm not married. So I went in the bathroom and hid the toothbrush. And then after he left, I kind of, in a way, sort of looked at myself and saying, why did I do that? First of all, if he has that much of a problem with me being gay, I probably really don't want to play with him.
Right.
But also, it's his problem. It's not my problem. And that was a sort of a, you know, the beginnings of something to me. And, you know, I would like to think of myself as kind of like file folders on a desktop, you know, and I'd like to be, you know, Fred the person who's hopefully a decent human being and who happens to be a musician and a pianist and plays jazz and composes and teaches, who happens to be gay, who happens to have HIV/AIDS, more or less in that order. You know, I feel like all the groundwork that I did in coming out the way that I did and the way that I did and when I did has made things so much easier for me, not only in my life in general, but my artistic life, because the price of closets is really steep. And you know, if you want to be honest as a musician, honest as a person, I mean, how can you hide such a fundamental fact? That doesn't mean you have to beat people over the head with it,
right?
But it's an undeniable fact.
Well, that idea, speaking of folders, let's file that away for 1 second, because your wording reminds me of a quote that I thought it might be interesting to respond to in this context, and this is from a recent book by Gary Burton called Learning to Listen. It's his autobiography, and you know, in it, his framing device in this book is an interview with Terry Gross that he did, and was basically his coming out to the world, and certainly to the jazz community. And towards the end of the book, he kind of comes back to this scene and says, one of the things I told Terry was that I considered myself a jazz musician first, who happened to be gay. These days, I think it might be the other way around. After all, I can go for hours and sometimes days at a time without thinking that much about music. But every moment of every day, I am aware of being gay. And that just struck me as a very, you know, there's a lot to that. And I wondered, you know, what your thoughts were along those lines. You know, the fact that you sort of mentioned a kind of order is you know, it's, I think, inherently interesting. And I wonder whether, you know, a gay jazz musician has to make that kind of you know, hierarchy in a way that someone else might not have to?
No, it's a very interesting and very challenging question. I mean, the difference, say, between Gary Burton, who, when he did come out, it was on National Public Radio. He won, you know, a gazillion Grammys. He'd been a jazz star since he was 21, you know, and me, who was dealing with HIV/AIDS, and my career was, you know, kind of there, but not near where it is now. So it was a different, maybe, level of risk.
And it was also later in sort of the culture.
It was also later historically. Yes, it was later historically, and I don't feel like I'm a gay jazz musician. I really do feel like I'm a musician, you know, member of the world community who happens to be gay, and you know, I don't believe. This is just my opinion. I have two things I want to say. One is that I don't believe that there is such a thing as a, quote, gay aesthetic in music. Otherwise, I mean, how would you reconcile Cecil Taylor, who is probably one of the most aggressive improvisers coming out of the jazz tradition, you know, and then somebody who was...
And then Stan Getz.
And then Stan Getz, or Miles Davis, or Chet Baker, or Bill Evans, who are unabashedly heterosexual, but able to play ballads that would break your heart. You know, I don't think that that's, you know, and then you get into, you know, various classical composers who were or were not, or, you know, differences between Cole Porter and Richard Rodgers or Irving Berlin. I mean, so, you know, but I want to just go back to one point is one of the reasons that I felt like I could not come out as gay fully in the jazz community until I did was, and this is just kind of Fred's theory, I don't know, it's not proved, but it's just what I think. When you're playing creative jazz music with people, there's a very intense level of intimacy and trust and kind of emotional engagement. If you're not just kind of going through the motions and playing at a jam session, but I mean really playing like in a band or making music that is really fresh and spontaneous. And I think I kind of psyched myself to think, well, you know, I play with a lot of emotional intensity. Maybe people will mistake this for me wanting to come on to them or get into bed with them, or, you know, and I wanted to keep the music pure and not have that enter the bandstand.
Right.
But now that it has, it's like, well, why didn't I do that earlier? But times have changed.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us back to another point that you mentioned, which was, you know, this idea of, especially in improvised music, you're sort of giving of yourself. And so if there is a part of you that you're kind of squelching or you know, sort of keeping, that has to have some effect on your output. Can you speak to that a bit and talk about how you've experienced that in terms of, you know, being open and allowing flow, and you know, whether there was a time when you felt that was kind of hindered?
There are a couple of incidents that I would also say are formative for me in this regard. One is there was a young jazz pianist in Houston, Texas named Dave Catney, a very talented guy. He died at 32 of AIDS. And he always kind of felt, well, if the chips are down, you know, my parents will take care of me. Well, they disowned him. And I was so incensed by the fact that people could think that this really lovely, talented human being could bring shame onto their family I said, you know, I've got to stand up. I mean, that was one thing. And I think, can you backtrack to your question again?
Sure. I was talking about the sort of the creative outflow and how.
Yeah, and the second part is, you know, I went through a near-death experience. You know, I was in a coma for 2 months as a result of pneumonia and subsequent sepsis, and didn't know if I would ever play the piano at an elite level again or be able to function at all. So I think between, you know, the early coming out in 92, 93, and then kind of coming back from the dead, you know, at this point, if I play a chord that I don't like, well, at least I'm alive to play that chord, you know.
Right.
And I've certainly let it rip a lot more, and I think also, I mean, you learn things when you learn them, but I've learned that the more that I kind of let things go, the more people seem to dig the music, not just the audiences, but the critics. And it's like, why didn't I do this earlier? Well, I just wasn't ready to do it earlier. Right. Maybe I needed that wake-up call, you know, to be able to just get into that flow more often than not, and just to be who I am and have that be enough.
Well, you sort of alluded to your, you know, the coma and that experience, and I think it's worth noting for anyone who doesn't know that Fred has a piece called My Coma Dreams, which was a sort of interdisciplinary music and theater and visual work that premiered at Montclair State University in
2011.
Okay. And then subsequently played at the Miller Theater where I saw it. There's a DVD that was filmed at the Miller Theater, right? That's coming out on November 25th.
It's really in honor of World AIDS Day.
But it's an extraordinary work and very personal, you know, inspired by this both horrific and surreal experience that you had. And so why don't we briefly talk about that work specifically?
Sure. 2008 was like a really shitty year in every respect. You know, I started the year with advanced AIDS-related dementia, the virus that got into my brain, and I was completely psychotic, paranoid, delusional, antisocial for 3 months. Then I recovered, and then in June of 2008, I developed a pneumonia unrelated to AIDS, and it was diagnosed. By the time we did something about it, I was in septic shock and near death, and I was rushed into the emergency room and the ICU, and coma was induced, and I was under for 2 months. And when I came out, I had a lot of rehab. I had to learn how to speak again, how to eat again. I lost the use of a vocal cord, you know, my future was uncertain on every level. But I remember the series of 8 dreams really precisely. Colors, sounds, smells, details. And so around September, October, when I recovered enough fine motor coordination, I typed them into onto my computer. And I just said, you know, I just kind of filed them. And then as I got better and better, and it got into 2009, I thought, well, you know, I've gone through this awful thing, and this is what I'm left with. And I think, you know, most any artist that you talk to will talk about the phrase found material. It's like, this is what I was left with. It behooves me to do something with it. So I showed it to my good friend, director, librettist Hersch. I said, I've got these dreams. I want to do something with video, maybe. What do you think? And he said, I'll take them away. Came back in a few weeks with this whole scenario of the piece starts with me getting sick and ending with me in rehab. But the great twist, other than the amazing video that we were able to do with animation and computer-generated imagery, was that one actor plays both me and my partner Scott. So we get my interior life through the music and the description of these dreams, and then we also get what he was going through.
And sort of a witness to, a very close witness to your condition, which is, with very personal, these were based on interviews with Scott, yes?
Right. Part was based on interviews with me and with Scott, and we actually performed this at an international medical conference of intensive care doctors. And some of them came up to me in tears afterwards and said, this is going to change the way I practice medicine. I'm no longer going to ignore the caregivers. And it's also the piece as a Valentine to my partner, who, with whom I would not have gotten through any of this.
Yeah.
So,
and you also had, it strikes me that it's crucial too that you had a precedent in your career by this point for a words and music piece. And it was a little over 10 years ago that you premiered the Leaves of Grass project. And I feel like 10, 12 years, thereabouts, this is a period that really marks a time where critics are fully on board, audiences are fully on board. It's an intensely creative period for you, and it coincides with doing things in both, in a trio, solo, duo, quintet, and then large ensemble. It's like very multi-platform, but also very personal. Has it felt like that for you?
it has felt like there are many modes of expression, and I'm able to access them more. I think Leaves of Grass certainly was a turning point. And of course people said to me, are you doing Whitman because he's gay? I said, well, no, I'm using Whitman's words to say what I would like to say about life and love and the human condition and nature and kindness that he can say better than anybody has ever said. You know, the fact that he's gay is a detail. I mean, I'm actually working on a new piece now. It's a collaboration with a wonderful American poet, Mary Jo Salter, who I met at the MacDowell Colony. It's going to premiere in a year, and it's called Rooms of Light, after a camera. A camera is a room of light, and it's called, it's a song cycle for the stage, 5 singers, theatrical lighting, and a mid-sized ensemble. And there are 16 different songs about aspects of photography, which is a very interesting subject. Whether it's advertising, x-rays and mammograms, paparazzi, iPhone photography, Photoshop, Civil War photography, iconic images of photography. And it really has nothing to do with jazz.
Right.
You know, there's no solos, there's no improvisation. They're going to be music theater singers, people reading the notes, more or less. And I think at this point in my life, I feel like I can do that. I mean, it will be mine because I am, it will be related to jazz because I'm at heart a jazz musician, but, you know, I feel like, I mean, I've been writing some really, some tunes in very different genres as the words dictate, and I feel free to do that. And, you know, if the jazz guys don't like it, well, too bad. I mean,
right.
I'm having a good time, you know?
Well, they have many other points of entry.
Right, they have other points of entry, you know, and you know, my trio is doing really well right now, and I'm just so thrilled for the success of this band.
I do want to, and I sort of have to wrap it up because I know we're going to have a few questions from the audience. This time has been flying by, for me at least. Let's talk about the trio. This record, Floating, that came out this year, you know, from the first time I heard this trio with John Hebert and Eric McPherson, I knew that this was just a really great you know, group of musicians together, and they supported you so well. You all seemed, you know, telepathic. But this album in particular, it's a convergence of that telepathy and then just some really great songs, you know, some compositions that feel like songs. Was that a concerted effort on your part? Did you feel, okay, I've got this great foundation with this trio, let's bring music to the table that is, that feels especially strong in that regard?
This album, Floating, is the third project for this band. The first was a studio album called Whirl, which was the first record I recorded after I came out of my coma. And, it was kind of like okay, Fred's back on the block kind of record, and I think there were some really good things about it. We hadn't been playing together that much. And then about 2.5 years ago, we did a 2-record set, Alive at the Vanguard, which contained both some new material and some older material re-recorded with this band. And about a year ago, last fall, I was at an artist residency in Umbria, pity me, in a 15th century castle, with amazing food and artists and all that stuff. And I was there to work on this Rooms of Light project, but I just started writing tunes. And I realized, well, I've kind of got a nice batch of stuff here. And we started playing them, and it turns out that of my new pieces, 6 of them were dedicated to different people, musicians, friends, and colleagues, to my mother and her mother. And then we went into the studio, and it was my first studio album. I'd done 3 previous live albums. And, but the feeling that we got in the studio was very much like a live recording, and so I decided to sequence the record just as you would hear a set.
Like you do a set?
Yeah, I mean, Nate's heard me do numerous sets. I usually start with some kind of take on a standard or something well-known, and then I do a batch of originals, and then there's always the killer ballad at the, the second to last song of the set. In cabaret parlance, that's what they call the 11 o'clock song. There's the 11 o'clock song, and then there's Something by Monk. I mean, it's just my format. It's what I do. And so we just put it down that way, and the reaction has been fantastic.
Well, it feels so relaxed, but then it has that just incredible studio sound. It's got the clarity and the depth and the warmth of the studio recording, but it feels like a good Vanguard set in a way.
Right.
I guess I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question. You've mentioned HIV/AIDS in conversation. It's come up. I think it's worth me sort of saying and then asking. In 1984, you released your first solo album, and it was was it that very year that you got your diagnosis?
85, yeah.
Okay.
It was within a year.
But I think it's really it's significant that the entirety of your solo career has coincided with your diagnosis, and I wondered if you could speak to what that has meant, what effect it had, how those two things are connected.
Definitely. Until the so-called cocktail drugs came along in the 1996, AIDS was, for most people, a death sentence. And I watched a lot of people die. And I put a lot of pressure on myself in the late 80s and early 90s because I thought, this is the last record I will ever make. Or I want to create enough of a body of work that if I die, people might remember me. It was just, that was kind of how it was. And I've had many periods of ill health over the years, where I've not, I've kind of been going on fumes. Fortunately, I'm on a great regimen. My health in every way is better than it was pre-coma. But I think just having that kind of cloud, it pushed me to push myself, but it also made me a little hard on myself. I think I was a little tight, a little perfectionistic, kind of, when you try to make history, you're less likely to do it. you know, history happens.
Right.
You know, you can't decide in the end. You know, you can't set out to make a classic album. You make an album, and maybe 20 years ago, people look back at it and say, "Man, that was a badass album." You know, so I think it's kept me productive. You know, and now that I'm going to be 60 next year, with all the attendant celebration of that, for somebody who didn't expect to be 40, you know, that's a pretty big deal. And to feel good in my artistic self and feel good in my personal life and feel good physically is really remarkable to me.
I think I'll speak for myself, but I think I can speak for a lot of people. There are some albums and some performances and a whole lot of other stuff that history will remember very, very fondly. And so I just wanted to say thank you for your output, your amazing body of work, and thank you for this conversation. I think this would be an appropriate moment for applause for Fred. It was like this, just this flow, this like chi or something, you know, that hadn't been there, was suddenly there. The music just felt that much more alive.
It's a big weight, and especially at this point in history, it's an unnecessary weight. And thank God we do have positive role models, not just in jazz. You can see by the list of people that's on the poster there, but you know, in all walks of life. And you know, when major political figures and the president and everybody else is saying, you know, there's no reason that, you know, gay people shouldn't have every possible right that everybody else has. I mean, it's a game change. And I never thought that I would see some of this in my lifetime. I'm sure many of us didn't think we would see this. So we're grateful for what's occurred, and we know that also there's more work to do.